Ever see a car on your street and it's got Ontario plates and you see it there every single day? You're like, that's interesting. This person seemingly lives in my neighborhood, but it's got Ontario plates and it's always there. And it's like a year later, you're still seeing their car and you're like, that's a little suspicious. And there's a part of Quebec where this happens quite a bit, the Outaouais, right? Just think about the border between Ontario and Quebec. There is a lot of that going on. There's a lot of Ontario plates on cars on Quebec streets, and there might be a reason for that. Tax evasion. In the 2022-23 taxation year, Quebec going after 137 people looking at where they're claiming residence, whether it comes to the Ontario side of the border or the Quebec side of border. And it could mean massive savings tax-wise. If you make $100,000 a year and you say, hey, I actually live in Ontario, not in Quebec, you can save a lot in taxes. And Revenue Quebec is going after more and more people who are doing just that. Let's go now to Harvey Bienenstock, a certified public accountant, a CPA, who joins us with more on this story. Harvey, welcome to the program.
Oh, welcome back, Elias. Good to hear you.
Thanks so much. So, Harvey, let's take a look at this. Why don't you explain to our listeners, and maybe a little bit better than I have here, what's going on here? Who's trying to scam the system?
Well, it's well known that Quebec has the highest tax burden of any jurisdiction in North America. So it's not surprising that people would try to take advantage of any way they can to reduce this. And one of those is that you know that if you lived in Ontario, you'd be subject to Ontario tax rates and not Quebec. And Quebec does treat its taxpayers pretty miserably, even though the top rate is the same in both provinces. If you were to make big money, Ontario will tax $233,000 at 53%. So if you make $233,000 now, it used to be $223,000, you would pay tax at 53%. Quebec also taxes top money at 53%, but Quebec starts taxing you at $112,000. So you're subject to the maximum tax rate in Quebec at almost half the money as in Ontario. Also, Quebec treats its taxpayers pretty miserably in that if you look at your paycheck, you'll notice that aside from your income taxes, you're paying into the pension plan, the unemployment insurance plan, the maternity plan, and these are deductible on your federal return because if you were to collect benefits, you'd be taxable on the benefits. Quebec will tax you on the benefits, but you get no deduction for your payroll taxes. You may not realize that. Also, if you had a home office where you try to make some money, you can deduct a portion of your home that you use for business. Quebec says, okay, take the federal deduction, cut it in half arbitrarily. We don't like you to deduct that amount. So Quebec kind of treats its taxpayers pretty miserably. And it's not surprising that people will try to relocate. Now, the tax system states that you are taxed in the jurisdiction where you live on December 31st. So if, for example, you were to give up your lease now on June 30th, or to acquire an Ontario address, as of December 31st, you say, I live here, and all the taxes you pay to Quebec gets transferred to the feds, and you have a saving. Now, it is not illegal to have two addresses. You can have an Ontario address and work in Ontario or work in Quebec. I mean, these are not illegal, but you have to prove that you do, in fact, reside there. And Quebec may get to the point where they use the IRS approach in the U.S., where you have something called a closer connection, where you have to prove that, like for snowbirds who have condos, that they are in fact Canadians. They'll ask you to prove where your closer connections, where your bank accounts are, where you shop, where you go to church, where you live. So if you did get an Ontario address, and the Outaouais, it's easy because you just can say, I work in Ontario, and you can commute to Quebec and nobody be the wiser. But don't forget, we're only about 60 miles from Hawkesbury. So if people in Quebec wanted to do the same, they would go and get an address in Hawkesbury and file as an Ontario resident. And again, they'd have to commute or prove that they spent more time at that address than they stayed in Quebec and they had closer connection over there. So it's not illegal, and it is very attractive.
So let's get to that, right? Because you say it's not illegal. Having said that, Revenue Quebec is going after people and at times getting money from these people that have been trying to avoid taxes. So if it's not illegal, how is Quebec successfully getting money back here from people?
Well, you just said. I mean, the neighbours have probably looked at these cars that are parked night after night on the Quebec driveway, and they ratted them out, as we say, to the government and said, hey, my neighbour has an Ontario plate, but he's here every night. So if they do approach this guy and say, hey, can you prove that your Ontario address is valid? And they can't because they may not have any documentation or proof that they are spending any time there. They're just claiming that they live there.
Okay, so when it comes down to it, you would have to prove that you're spending the time in Ontario. Even if you've got the paperwork, you'll have to prove that you were spending your time there?
Yeah, you have to prove that you have a closer connect, that is in fact your residence. You can have a cottage in Quebec or vice versa. You can have 2 places or 3 places. That's, up to you. But if you're going to claim tax residency at a particular spot in a particular tax jurisdiction, you have to be prepared to prove that is in fact your residence. Mm-hmm. And that's up to you if they ever question you. Okay, show me that you are in fact an Ontario resident.
I have a text message from a listener, right? And they write in, car with an Ontario plate. It is none of your business. Now, is it our business?
Well, this is how you establish Ontario residence. Once you do get an address in Ontario, you can continue to paper over that facade by saying, okay, I'll get an Ontario driver's license with my address on it. Then I will register my car with that address on it so that you can try to show everybody, look, I really am an Ontario resident. I have an Ontario driver's license, an Ontario plate, and you hope it doesn't go any further. Mm-hmm. But if the government does get suspicious because you got ratted out by your neighbor, don't forget, the only way the Quebec government found this is because they were denounced, as they said, under the Robespierre Act. They were denounced that by their neighbors that, hey, something's fishy here. And if they were not denounced, who knows if they would ever gotten caught.
So this is what's going on. It's neighbors ratting people out to Revenue Quebec.
Yes, that's the only way they find you, is that somebody spills the beans. Otherwise, you would just file an Ontario return. You have an Ontario address. You have your license. You have your car registration. Yeah, you have a Quebec address, but you never tell anybody about that. So you tell Quebec, I'm gone, and I live there now. And yeah, I do own a place here, and I visit it because, sometimes I have business here. And you never have to come clean unless government asks you. And this is only when somebody rats you out.
So, this is such an interesting topic here. We're with Harvey Bienenstock, a certified public accountant, a CPA, and we're talking about Quebecers / people who are in Ontario that are saying they live on one side of the border, but not actually living on the Ontario side of the border in order to take advantage of tax rates here. Harvey, is it fair to the Quebecers that pay the full taxes? I'm thinking about it that way, right? I pay my full Quebec taxes, and boy, do I ever hate seeing what the Quebec government takes off every paycheck. And boy, it doesn't seem fair if someone is able to take advantage of the rules here to avoid Quebec taxes. Shouldn't we? You live in Quebec, shouldn't you have to pay?
Well, yes, but there's also a famous precedent that says that it is not everybody's duty to pay the maximum taxes that they can. It is everybody's duty to try to pay the minimum taxes they can. Uh-huh. And I think the Wellington decision. And what happened there is that, if you think that your tax rates are fair, then by all means, you just, say, listen, I look around the world and say, which country would you rather live in? Very few compare to Canada. And once you choose Canada, what parts of Canada do you want to live in? Quebec might not be the best, but it's certainly not the worst. So you can say, I'm willing to pay for the privilege of living here. But then you say, is it fair that I'm paying taxes at a much higher rate than I am of the people next door? Why is one citizen of Canada so more highly taxed than another? Is it that much better to live here? And I suspect that given what's going on here politically, a lot of people may say, even if Ontario had a higher tax rate and I had to pay more taxes, I'd rather give them the money than send it to Quebec to pay for the cudgels and the whips that are used to bind and flog me.
Harvey,
so that might be something which is going to accelerate this kind of attitude.
Harvey, let me ask this to wrap up the interview. Is there a way to do this on the up and up? What is the bare minimum you could actually live in Ontario, and then even if Revenue Quebec came after you, you'd be able to say, sorry, I'm within the law, to the letter of the law, you can't come after me?
Yeah, you actually physically do acquire a residence there, and you work out of there. For example, if you have a home business, there's no need for you to be here. You can just run out of your business out of Ontario, and if you don't have, and you can commute to Quebec. I used to work with a guy who lived in Cornwall, and every day he'd commute to back and forth, and sometimes he'd stay over in a hotel for some of the days. So physically, you can manage it since we're so close to the Ontario border, and if you feel strongly enough about it, you can actually just get an Ontario address. You can give up your Quebec one or keep it, but as long as you are physically doing the work out of Ontario and commuting here and go back to home at night, there's no reason why you should be exposed.
Harvey, we have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
My
really
pleasure,
appreciated
Les.
this. That's Harvey Bienenstock, a certified public accountant.